Hi everyone, I'm Cindy. Welcome to my channel and my first ever book review video. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is gonna be a book ranking but also a book critique video, and I'm gonna start my ranking and critiquing from the book that I read since 2021 summer, because that's basically when I consider myself a college student. So the first couple of book is from last summer when I borrowed from Cupertino's library, and the first one is 女妖 by 江户川乱步 Edogawa Renpo. So for context, Edogawa Renpo is a very important Japanese novelist who helped the development of Japanese mystery and thriller genre. And if you're seeing this anime character right here, you're probably already familiar with the author's name. So my review on this book, I think it is a very solid crime short story collection. And it's pretty impressive how Edogawa Renpo is able to finish a full-on crime story within that amount of length. I think that's pretty good. But at the same time, I also feel that it's formulaic in a sense. Like, a lot of elements in a book is just, it feels a little bit cliche-ish to me, maybe because I've seen a lot of time. Like, for example, there's this clown-ish person or something that appeared on the street, and then somebody died, and then there's like a neighborhood girl, blah 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 blah. I think that, in consideration to how Renpo wrote this a long time ago, maybe these kind of ideas are really new back then, but for me right now, I think I've seen it many times, so it's not necessarily bad, but at the same time, I feel that I was expecting more from him, and so it's kind of basically like watching a very Hollywood movie that may potentially be a little bit old-fashioned. So yeah, but in general, this is a great book, and it does surprise me. So I think I'm gonna place this one as a solid A. So let's go to the next one. Alright, so next up, 人间失格 by 太宰治 or No Longer Human by Dazai Osamu, a legendary Japanese author who also tried to kill himself for 5 times. So bear with me, because for this one, I think I'm gonna spend a longer of time talking about it. I really like it. For No Longer Human, I think it is a very, very interesting piece. And so first of all, this is another short story collection book. And then unlike the last one by Renpo's, this is not limited to a formulated plot story structure. So I feel that it's much more dynamic to me in that sense, with different lengths of short pieces. And I think Dazai is he's a really interesting person. Like, you can tell that he's very emotional from reading his pieces, and he's very sensitive to a lot of things. But at the same time, it's not that his writing is very dramatic or like character, or there's too much dramatic actions or emotional aspect within his writing. Instead, it's like, on the contrary, his writing almost feel very static in a sense. Like, for No Longer Human, there's movement within the immobility. It's a story that's half based on Dazai's own life, so you can say it's half real and half fiction. And in some parts of it, he talked about how he tried to put on an act to fit in with the group. So he have to make himself kind of not himself in order to pursue a persona in a functioning society. I think that's a really interesting point. It kind of highlights the oppressive aspect of collectivism in some point, and it also widely also highlights how misery it feels when you're feeling like an outcast, or you doesn't feel socially fit into what other people are talking about. It's also highlighting how weird is the oddity of the whole ritualistic aspect of social events and social formation. So in that sense, I think it's really, I feel this dude, okay? Also, a lot of things that he said based on his experience and his life about himself, like being alcoholic and going out with a woman and running away from responsibility, escapism, will just categorize him as being an asshole. But, like, interestingly and weirdly, his words just somehow made it work. It's like, I feel that he made a good case for being an asshole. Like, his work, no, his words, I mean words, and literature in a sense, they're just so artistic in a sense that you kind of sympathize with him. The part where he mentioned his childhood experience being unable to recognize social relationships kind of just made me wonder if he's autistic or Asperger-ish in that sense. And where he talks about women, it's actually, it doesn't come off as misogynistic to me, and even some of them seems like they're advocating for the opposite of it. I think he struggles with his masculinity. That's what it is. Like, I don't know, this guy is so, I just want to know what's going on with this dude. Anyway, the book itself, for me, it is an S. I really like No Longer Human. I gotta reread it and to do my further analysis on it. So next up is Rashomon by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, another writing collection by a legendary Japanese author. And I saw this book in the library and I thought that I must borrow it with Dazai if anybody understands. So the movie of this one is actually considered a cinematic triumph for the psychological thriller genre, and it earned international success. I saw the movie in LA and I think it's pretty good, but it's actually really different from the original short story. And unfortunately, I like the movie better. So props to Akira Kurosawa for that. And just, I don't know if this is a translator's issue, but reading Rashomon after No Longer Human, I feel that it's a little bit bland to me. I feel that it's a mix between the female monster and No Longer Human in terms of style. And I think each individual short pieces, they have interesting points to it and they're concise, which I usually like. But at the same time, I just feel like each of them kind of lack a click to me that will stay long. Like, I think just for Dazai's No Longer Human collection, each of them kind of have a unique, different click to me. So just based on my experience with Rashomon collection here, I would give it a solid B, but I would definitely love to read more of his work to have more in-depth thoughts on what's going on. So next up, Exile and the Kingdom by Albert Camus. He's regarded as one of the most important 20th century French writer, and of course, I do read the Chinese translation of it. And immediately you can tell that it's very different in style from the Japanese authors that I've read so far. There's much more descriptive languages on the sceneries. There's a lot of fancy vocabularies. Each stories are longer and there's a lot of dialogue. So I guess it's very Western in a sense. So I think this is also why I thought that the original French version might be better. But a lot of story, I feel that they don't really have a clear plot to me. So for some of them, I got boring in the middle, and I do have to remind myself to finish it. So I searched up Albert Camus, finally, and absurdism and existentialism came up. So I was like, oh yeah, that's what that is. It's like, it feels absurd reading some of his story. I think in general, it does give me an exhaling vibe. I'll give this a solid B. Now moving on to 2021's fall. So I'm in college, yay! Next up is 1930年代的沪上文学风景 or 1930 Shanghai's literary landscape. I adore this book. So I think for me, it is like an intro to a lot of important and famous Chinese literature figure at that time. But it's also not just that. This also includes the author's summary and critiques on things such as one of the importance or the most popular Chinese magazine at the time is rises and fall, and also includes things like blah 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 review to this Russian literature, which inspired them to do something something, and or this Japanese author critique on their work, and then they critique back on the Japanese critique or review. So it's kind of like one of those YouTube react video, which is really fun. It also reveals a lot of political dynamic perspective at the period, and it gives us a lot of it. It's a very rich experience to me, and also all those pictures, they're just awesome, right? I think if you wanna read a book about 1930 Chinese literature on a specific area or with detailed research, I think this is not good enough. But if you don't really know anything about this topic and just kind of want to get an overview of what is going on at the time, I think this book is perfect. I think it's just perfect, right? I think for me it's just all right. It's just perfect. So this one is on my S tier. So next up, 1984 Taiwanese prose collection. So this picture is not what the actual book actually looks like. It is very plain. It looks like this. Like there's nothing. And it says 1984 Taiwanese prose here. And they have a whole collection of it based on different years. They all select one work from one author and make into a collection. So I think the book is a very nice and enjoyable read to me. It does have some of the few prose does top my all-time favorite prose list. I remember there's this one story where the author described the three animals that he encountered in his life in their stories. So there's this pig, a cow, and a dog. So there's this pig, the only surviving baby from difficult birth. The mom died later, who turns out to be full of illnesses, very violent, and super mad. And then there's the working cow that's cleverly lazy at times, timid, and super lustful. Then there's this extremely loyal dog that's abandoned by a family and who died on the street waiting for them. With each short story of the animal's life, the tone switches a little bit from aggressive, funny to sad. But underlying it all is a consistent, realistic narrative from the author. But ultimately, after reading it, what you're getting is not just the animal story, it's also the story of the human within them, as well as the nature of the people surrounding them based on their final treatment and their endings. Okay, next up, Robert Penwarren's All the Kingsmen. So from here on, if I have the physical books, I will just get it in my hand and I'll show it to you. So this is actually my professor's favorite book. I read this in a theology seminar for this book. And then it says, can you see? A definitive American story. The name of Willie Stark is the name now immortal on the page. This is a American political novel. I think it definitely deserved the name. And the writings are really, really sophisticated. And some of them are really deep languages. So you have to read it many times to kind of understand what the author is saying. The language can get a little bit too introspective in some way. It's like just the narrator talking on and on and on and on about stuff, and so that you kind of get lost on the plot. Also, I don't exactly like some of the female characters described in this book. I think they're cool, but I feel like they need more developments. So, in general, it does have a very cool, shocking plot twist at the end, though. I'm gonna give this book like a okay. Next up is King Kong series by Virginie Despentes. This book is about her, which is a filmmaker who also happened to be an outcast and had been a prostitute in the past. It's her talking about her experience political thought on things and just a lot of ideas in general. But it's a really short and nice read. And as the author began in the first quote, it says, "I write from the realms of the ugly, for the ugly, the old, the bull dykes, the frigid, the hysterics, the freaks, all those excluded from the great meat market of female flesh." Which is intriguing enough for me to want to buy this in my school's bookstore. And I think in general, because the author is speaking from a personal voice, and I think it's fairly impactful, and it's a really bold book. I will give this like a B plus or a A minus, but because of the fact that I think it does has a powerful voice, I will give this a A minus. Alright, next up is this one. 从验史到信史，同治书学与近现代中国的男性建构。From, it says, the English title, From Amorous History to Sexual History, Tongji Writings and the Construction of Masculinity in Late Qing and Modern China, by Wei Shen Su, which the author's name is literally one character away from my dad. And actually not much else needed to be said. This book is on my top S tier. It's S+. It blew my mind, okay? So it became one of my favorite books of all time. It changed the way I thought about like modern assumption about masculinity and femininity, as well as how the two gender ideology have to deal with power relationships from the personal to the national and international level. It is so good that when I was reading it, I have to stop reading it and return it to the UCLA YRL library until I visited Taiwan to buy the actual book, because I can't find one here, so that I can highlight it with my highlighter. That's how good it is, I guess. And I actually didn't finish it. It have different part. I stopped at the part where the author start talking about analyzing individual literature pieces. But I think the first part is enough, and honestly, I seriously think that this book should be incorporated into the education system. Oh yeah, also I think in USC, because I might do reference this book in my first commentary video, and I might also even make a separate video just talking about the details of what this research is about. Okay, now going off into spring. So these, a lot of books I read, most books I read in spring are from this Intro to Fiction class that I took, and we have to read 6 books in 10 weeks, because that's just how a quarter works. And the first book that we read is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And this is the book that make modern Christmas possible, that in a way we know today. And I think the story itself and the language, it gives me a mature and sophisticated folk tale kind of vibe. So it's like fairy tale, but in a more modern Western version. But I don't know, I just didn't feel like I get really immersed into the language. Maybe it's because I have to look up vocabs, but also there's something about his writing style that makes me not able to immerse as much. It feels very oral. It's like storytelling, like, oh, once upon a time, there's this character, blah, blah, blah. And I guess that's just not exactly my style. But in general, I think the story is pretty solid. I think it has a good idea. In general, I would give this book like a B for me, but since it made Christmas possible, I'm gonna give it a B+. That's great. Okay, next up is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So for this one, the title of Jane Eyre in Chinese translation, Jane Ai, actually, I thought it means simple love this whole time in my life until I got into this class. But comparing to the simple love idea that I have at first, this book is actually a much darker romance novel. And I'm all for it, to be honest. I think the fact that the supposed Prince Charming is actually ugly in a conventional sense is what actually makes it interesting, I think, and unique in a sense. I think this is a very, very rich book, especially with the Bertha Mason plot. Spoiler, but basically the Prince Charming, he hid this Bertha Mason, an African American woman, in an attic this whole time, and she was like this big, giant, monstrous woman who can even overpower him. So some people say, yeah, this is definitely racist, but at the same time, you can also argue that it's representing a sort of oppressive force against African American women. That's my thought. For you guys can interpret it in different ways. There's also a lot of religious aspect to this book, like Christianity versus the female identity that Jane Eyre have to go through. It's a really interesting book that can be interpreted in almost opposite ways in a lot of sense. But in general, I think the writing itself is very good. I really enjoy reading this. It doesn't make me feel bored at all. So I'll give it like a high A and a low S, I think. And I guess because I wrote a good paper on it, I'll give it S minus. Okay, next up, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This, the first official sci-fi, I guess. Also, she wrote it when she was 18 years old, which is really impressive. Gotta give her credit for that. Then, the book itself and the story structure, I think is pretty interesting. It's like a story within a story within a story. It's somebody telling a story that somebody tells somebody, and that somebody tells a story about the somebody telling story. So yeah. And unlike how the popular culture portray Frankenstein as this gigantic monster, the Frankenstein in this book is actually really kind at first. He got evil at the end because of how humans treated him with coldness. So in that aspect, I really like this twist and idea, and it's just that makes him he may be more annoying than a lot of the villains actually. So yeah, this book, when I was reading it, there's some parts where they just go on and on about story that I thought I got a little bored, but I think in general I'll give this like a middle or A minus. Yeah, I'll give it A. Okay, next one. Frankenstein in Baghdad by Aman Sadawi, sorry. This is a very awesome book. I really like it. It's basically Frankenstein, but in modern time, Iraq and during Iraq War. So the so-called Frankenstein in this book is actually, or what's its name, is actually composed of different dead body parts from people that die because of the war. And then the monster basically have to try to kill or harm the original body part owners, the person who killed those body parts basically. But then the body part will fall off if he didn't avenge in time, so he also ended up collecting new victims' bodies. So it's like an on and on vicious cycle. Is this monster actually justice or not? It's a very interesting and thoughtful idea. I really like that. And then it also has the writing style is very modern, and it switched between different storytellers. It offers a good deals of perspective and highlights the ecosystem of the media system in modern time. I'll give this one a S. It's a good S. I think I'll put it here. Okay. Next one is Emma by Jane Austen. I was waiting to compare Jane Austen to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, but this book, it is a romance novel, and the plot was about this young, beautiful, and smart lady from high class and her romance triangles that was also created by her trying to navigate the romance interest for her besties. But to be honest, like reading this, I got bored, okay? Like, it's very daily life focused. It's just a bunch of different relatives and doing stuff. It feels very Victorian-ish, but I guess just after reading Frankenstein in Baghdad, I have to turn my head around to feel this more calmer vibe of Emma. And then of course it's also during the quarter, so I just switch. I don't even finish this book, I skip it. And it's the only book that I skipped for the class. Like, so in general, I'll give it a meh. Emma is a meh for me now. C. But I will definitely want to finish it in the future to see what is my actual feeling on Jane Austen, because as you guys all know, she's an icon. Okay. Next up. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. The original one is already in English because Kazuo Ishiguro is a Japanese who grew up in UK. And then for this book, I love this novel. It topped my favorite novelist of all time, I'll say. And it's a sci-fi. I'm not usually too into sci-fi genre, but for this one, it's a sci-fi. It's also a very humanity-focused sci-fi. So there's not much science about it. Instead, it's about these clone children who have to donate their body parts to real society, to real human by the end of their life. So they basically die that way and just decay through time. But do they deserve that? Don't they deserve humanity too? Because they basically have everything that a human body have. And then what really makes a human human? Is it human identity, family identity, a history? Like, they don't have that. So what you see in this novel is just they collect books, like for example, to make their identity. So they try to recreate their own identity. But isn't that what humans do all the time? Like, you can also say that my iPhone represents my identity too, right? So this is definitely very good question is asked within this book. And the writing style is very distinct. Like, Ishiguro can make the most concise languages hit on the right spot. It's also very weirdly nostalgic in a sense. Like, it's written from the perspective of a seemingly unreliable or narrator, though through her eyes you can see what it's like to grow up in the system and be one of them. And then it just brings back memory about those uniform time in middle school. It literally just feels like that. So yeah, I think Ishiguro deserved his Nobel Prize though with his writing. Put this here. Okay, so next is up to the summer of 2022, and there's this one time that I visited a LGBTQ center with my friend, and I discovered that there's a library, so I ended up borrowing two books. One is The Vagina Monologue by Eve Ensler, and then the other one is like Male and Female Homosexuality by the person's name whom I can't recall. Let's first talk about the Vagina Monologue first. So for this one, I think the Vagina Monologue it's cool that it gives me an inspiration for a short story called Susie and Go, 小西与羊. And the book itself is really fun to read. It's very short. It is about like composes a lot of story, including how historically the female autonomy is tabooed or it is stigmatized for just being female, and how people navigated those stigmatization. And there's also like include some interview that Answer had to women and their experience with their body, or it even has some poems that some women written themselves talking about exploring their own autonomy. Like, in general, I think this book, it is inspirational, and yeah, it's this one. I think I'll give it like a A, I guess. I think that's good. But for the next one, the male and female homosexuality, I don't really like that book. Like, let me explain. So this book is an old book. So it's written, I think, in around 1980 or 1970-ish. It's a little bit too old, but I already borrowed it. So I didn't even look up the time of it, but I just thought it's interesting. So I want to see what they have to say. While there are some data about, like, how they're trying to do research and stuff, but they already have a lot of assumption that's going on about that's my brother. But anyway, I will continue my video, sorry. But there's a lot of like generalization about just how homosexual people are. For example, they just assume the girls are gonna all be tomboy-ish and then the guys are just gonna be sissies. I think that's definitely just too generalized. And then it's also kind of sexist in a sense. There's this one woman saying that, oh yeah, the lesbian, yeah, you can tell she's a lesbian because she likes science, which is a boy's subject. And I'm like, ugh, okay. I think this book it could be misleading. I'm gonna give it a terrible. My first terrible. Okie dokie, let's go to when I visit Taiwan during the summer. And I read this heavy The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, but the Chinese version of it, 历史学家. Because there's a English version too, but it's literally this thick, okay? I really like it in general. The story is about a dad explaining his life with his daughter. So when he was in a college, he was a history student, and then he met this professor. He found this mysterious book that his professor also happened to have, and then the professor mysteriously disappeared with blood on his desk. So the dad, also with another woman that's interested in vampire, they began this whole journey to Europe trying to find their professor and look for the roots of this mysterious book, end up making themselves encounter Dracula and also other vampires. This book also is not just a fantasy. This is a very solid historical fiction. A lot of them are based on real historical fact about Dracula and the European history. So in that aspect, there's also a lot of different types of writing mediums, such as the letters, the manuscripts. So by reading all of those, as well as switching different timeline of the book, you literally becomes the historian yourself too, which is cool. And by the end of it, I think one of the message of the book is that perhaps it is not the Dracula that is the biggest monster and the evil of everything. It is the human that is the greatest evil of our own. So I really like that idea. Like, with this immense amounts of detail and how complex the story is, but being able to not make them confusing, boring, and actually very enjoyable and to read. I think this book definitely deserves to be on an S tier. Alright. Next one. 厌女 by 上野千鹤子, or Misogyny in Japan, I would say. Misogyny in Japan by Shizuko Uno. Shizuko Uno is a well-known Japanese feminist and a professor. It touches upon a lot of like different topics regarding gender, especially on a woman's perspective. It's a thought-provoking book, and it really just showcases how, like, even though we might consider that gender equality is already achieved, but misogyny can still literally be so widespread and so ingrained into our collective consciousness and the way of doing things and thinking about things that it can stings like air like needles in the air in a way so subtle that you wouldn't even know how to respond to the weird kind of pressure that you're feeling. But at the end of it, interestingly, the author says that yeah, men also have a lot of problems, but they have to solve it themselves. Because if you, a lot of the time when people talk about, oh yeah, yeah, woman face blah blah blah, then people are like, okay, yeah, what about men? But the thing is, both patriarchy also affects men, but just in different ways. So that's why I thought this book actually works really well together. There are a lot of interesting topics that's basically connected if you compare them. For example, like how homophobia is linked to the hate on women and femininity. I think they go together, are kind of unstoppable, to be honest. I think this book is really interesting if you consider that any type of really famous feminist book run the risk of having people fighting a war on us versus them, the victims versus the predator. But I think it's definitely much more complex than that. So I want to do a separate video in the future just specifically focus on this book and the details and analyze it. This book, I'm gonna give it like a good S. So next up is 发现女同志、男同志、双性恋与跨性别. The English translation is discover the female, male, homosexuals, bisexuals, and transgender. So you know how I bought this book in Taiwan and I got it through one of my dad's bookstore account, and he kind of got this book for me and he's like, okay, yeah, I think this one's better. And then I read it. I didn't finish it though, sorry about that, but I do have 2 unfinished summer book beside this one. It's literally a textbook, but it's a good size that you can fit it into your backpack, so that's good. I think for this book, so far for me it's a so okay, it's like here, very detailed, and it's just like one of those sociology textbooks you might read, but I'll finish it, and if I'm gonna make a future ranking video, maybe it might reappear just because I finish it. So now let's move on to the next one. So next up is 丰乳肥臀 by Mo Yan. Its English translations is big breasts and wide hips. Just the name itself is very eye-catching to me, and my friend kind of talks about it, recommended it to me and my friends, and I searched up this book. So it's by Mo Yan. He's also a Nobel Prize winner, and I think he definitely deserved that because the language of this book is stunning. It's really unique in style, and it's a mix between I don't know exactly how to even describe it, but it's dramatic in a sense, but you're feeling like you're seeing a painting move, a modern kind of Chinese style painting. It is, just by reading some of the scenery description that he have, it's very, very visually vivid. It's really stunning. It's like it's almost fantastical, but then it's also not. It's written in a really realistic style, but there will just be some very obscure thing that's happening in a weird way that's also very relatable, if you understand what I mean. But I didn't finish the whole book, well, just like the last one, but I think it's gonna be on my revised like ranking list in the future after I'm done with it, because I'm not sure if I would change my feeling about this book, but just reading the first part of it is really on a good shape. It's a good S tier for me. Oh yeah, and also I thought the writer was a woman at first because of how like he described the birth thing. I'm like, oh my god, it's so vivid. And then I searched it out and it's like a guy, so I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. And he also said that this piece is one of the pieces that's most related to his identity, which is so interesting. I'm gonna like look more into Mo Yan later. Okay, next up. Whee! Joan Didion's The White Album is finally reaching 2022 fall, and I'm a sophomore, so it's my introduction to new journalism. So for context, new journalism is a new kind of journalism style where the author insert a more personal voice regarding to talking about recording things that happen or news. This it developed after 1960, and you can see the effect of it still very prominent today. The language is pretty fancy, I would say. She's good at writing. For some of the writing that I kind of even have to reread it to kind of understand what she's talking about. But anyway, I think if you want to be a journalist or if you want to write your own journal, reading this book will give you a lot of inspiration on how you want to write them. As you can see with these pages. It's a pretty cool book. I think I'll give it A. Okay, next up. This one, 为集权台潮的努力 by Mi Kwang. In English, I will translate it to the slaves who help lift the bridge for totalitarians or dictators. Yeah, sounds very provoking, and that's exactly why the first time I saw this in the library, I was like, that's cool, I'm gonna borrow it. And it's actually also during the same period where the white paper protest was going on. Every entry kind of just goes like this, literally just 2 pages. But after reading it, I think I don't really exactly like this book that much, because I feel that for a lot of things that he's talking about, it's just 2 pages, and I feel that a lot of them, I want more context about what he's talking about, and a lot of it is just kind of making an irony on yourself. It's like, oh yeah, so China is so bad, blah blah blah, and everybody is dying, kind of like this tone. And while I feel bad, I think it's a lot of things that he talked about is definitely valid and it's very terrible, but at the same time I don't like how the narrative of criticizing this totalitarian society in such a sense that it also glorifies democracy. It's kind of like, oh yeah, democracy might be the solution to all of these, and then the fact that people doesn't have the power of information is the most damaging thing ever. Yeah, it's definitely very, very damaging that you don't have information, but at the same time, I think information can be weapon too. Like, I thought there's this one section where he talks about this Taiwanese grandma who is able to just publicly, like, just be really angry about and just say a lot of bad things about the presidents, right? And then he say, oh yeah, I envy that, people envy that so much. And then I feel that that's incredibly sad, but then at the same time, I feel like, I don't know, like, just a grandma just hating on the government publicly. Is that necessarily like the best ideal image of what a democracy could be? But and also at the same time, the thing where he talks about corruption within the government official, it still happens in democratic society too. And this title too, if you think about it in a different way, people can also help lift a totalitarian style leader or dictator stuff or made bad choices in a democratic society, like how, for example, Hitler was also elected through democracy initially. So I think democracy is definitely, it has much more check and balances, so which is good, but at the same time I don't want to just generalize and make the idea that, oh, only one type of government is like good and the other type is just extremely bad. Yeah, I'll give this book just a meh. Next one, and also my last book, I got this from an airport, Sex Called None, and I read it this winter break. So this is by Faith Jones, and it says, breaking away from the children of God, a wild radical religious cult. There's like pictures of this author's life. It is, for me, this book is incredibly rich, to be honest. Her life is basically, it's so crazy that she had to go through so many things. Like, she was born in Hong Kong, she grew up there, and then you know, it's a missionary family, so they go out and sing and do a lot of good work. They basically live, because they were running away from the government, so they have to rebuild this 100 years old somewhere around Hong Kong countryside house, and eventually they win the hearts of the neighborhood. The author, she have to educate herself for high school, and she eventually graduated from college, and she left the whole group. She also been to a lot of different places, like Japan. She went to Taiwan, she's been to Russia, and she was also in China. So you can see a lot of different experience of like different kind of experience of the cultures, how it makes a difference. And especially one scene where she talked about the Japan experience was also, it caught my eyes. I think I'm gonna search it up soon. It says that basically she and one of her kind of like a missionary partner will go out, right? And then she went into this 7-Eleven, and then she saw this magazine of just a man basically raping a woman, and then she said, oh my god, that's disgusting. And then her basically her partner says that, oh yeah, but like in Japan you can find a vending machine where they just sell girls used panties. And I'm like, what? Wait, okay, I'm gonna search up right now. So dude, bro, what? It says that in 1993 they got banned. So yeah, I guess that means that it's true, because it gotta be true to be banned. Okay, yeah, vending machine everywhere. Like, what? Dude, okay, yeah, if I'm ever gonna study abroad in gender study, Japan is the place. Mark my word. Okay, cool. Back to the book tier and the book. So anyway, it also talks about a lot of how you can see how a government system can be really closely tied to religion and a certain type of philosophy, and how socialization and hierarchy can be established so like intimately connected to one person's identity. Also, one of my favorite part about this book is the ending, where she talks about how a lot of ideas that her grandpa had are not new. You know, a lot of the abusive ideas, or ideas, for example, about sexual freedom, that they basically just turn around the table and use love as a justification for all kinds of sex in this code. It's not entirely new, and are actually also within the society that we have right now. Yeah, it says here, many of grandpa's message were taught and still are taught in society and churches. And she talks about how her mom, you know, also got raped before she's even in the cult, as well as some of her relatives. So it's not much more common than people thought. And also because since cult are demonized, right? But if you think about it, if isn't the cult potentially just a Microsofted view but extreme version from a lot of things that is just rampant around the real society too? Oh yeah, her grandpa is the founder of this cult. Hi, so I didn't record that part well, and I already placed this here. It's on my S tier. So cool. Now it's done with my book ranking, my crazy book list for 2021 and 2022. For Happy New Year, and for my New Year resolution, I do want to finish whatever book that I'm not done with on this list so that I can get a further review. And I also want to read these 3 books that I got it from library. The first one is this. It says Stories of Old China. And so yeah, they even got the English translation. It's right next to it. It's traditional Chinese writing. And then look at the differences. It's so cool. Seems like fun. And I also borrowed this because I was writing this short story and it's based on kind of like a East Asian setting, so ancient East Asian setting. So yeah, I hope reading this will give me some inspiration on how to write, the vibe of it. And the next up is this one, 妖狐验视. So it means basically like monster or ghostly, foxy ghost history. And then it says China's historical banned destroyed short story collection, national and international treasured secret book version. Sounds very attractive to me. And then it even has pictures inside, if you can see. Oh, you can. Yeah, it has pictures. Then finally, I have this one, 台北人, Taipei People by Bai Shenyou. Cool. So that's it for my book ranking video. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Also, I think the
等一下，
most...
等一下，wait.
What?
Wait.